Today. It is unclear what the fate of that crew is so far, but there is an active search and rescue effort underway, according to those U.S. officials. We're still awaiting any confirmation, though, from the White House. It's unclear right now, with the president having no public events on his schedule. We're waiting to hear whether, in fact, he has been briefed on the ongoing situation. But this comes just 2 days, Joe, after the president gave a primetime address to the American people, making his case for the ongoing operation inside Iran, saying that the U.S. would continue airstrikes for the next 2 to 3 weeks, but that the military goals in Iran were nearing completion. Of course, up until this point, U.S. officials had said that there had been 13 casualties among U.S. service members. Again, still a lot of questions about this particular incident, but we do understand that an F-15 has come down over Iran. Unclear exactly what the fate of the crew is at this point, but we're awaiting any more information from the president or the White House at this point, Joe.
Gabe, we are still waiting to hear more from the White House specifically about this, but the president has been talking a lot over the last several hours about what is happening in Iran, the U.S. military's efforts there. What is it we have heard from the president?
Certainly. Well, just earlier today, and this comes, again, as I mentioned, this speech that he gave, this primetime address, a rare primetime address for the president, he suggested that U.S. operations may be winding down after a brief period of escalation. But just this morning, the president suggesting that if the U.S. were to have more time, that U.S. officials could go in and take the oil from the Strait of Hormuz, and therefore opening up, raising questions about how long the U.S. does plan to continue this military campaign inside Iran. However, the Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, as well as President Trump, have repeatedly said that Iran's missile capabilities have been degraded significantly, that their missile attacks have been down more than 90% since the war began. Still, though, this does suggest, this downing of this F-15 fighter jet does suggest that Iran still does have potentially significant capabilities, although again we're still waiting to hear what the exact circumstances of this downing of this F-15 fighter jet are. But again, Joe, the president this morning raising the possibility that it won't be such a quick withdrawal from the Middle East, from Iran, as he suggested just 2 days ago.
All right, Gabe, we'll ask you to continue to stand by there at the White House. Let's go to our international correspondent, Raf Sanchez, who is in Doha, Qatar. Raf, we have been hearing a lot of reporting from Iran state media throughout the morning here. Wanted to wait till we got more official word from those U.S. officials before coming on the air with this new information. But what have we been hearing out of Iran today?
So, Joe, we have been hearing from authorities in Iran that this American warplane went down in an area of the south of the country. This is a mountainous region. It is a tribal region. A lot of the population there are made up of nomadic tribes, and authorities in those provinces are saying that they are putting out a reward for anyone who is able to capture this aircrew. They do not seem to know at this point whether these pilots are alive or not, but they are saying it is a priority for them to be taken into custody in Iran. They are offering a reward the equivalent of $60,000, and they are saying capturing them alive is the priority. Now, Joe, if it is confirmed that this aircraft was indeed shot down, that would be the first confirmed downing of an American aircraft by hostile fire during this war. You will remember about 3 weeks ago, a refueling plane collided with another aircraft over Iraq. It crashed. 6 service members were killed there. And then in the early days of the war, 3 F-15s were shot down over Kuwait. That was a friendly fire incident. Those were American aircraft shot down by the Kuwaiti Air Force. Iranian state media does seem to be reporting that some kind of rescue operation is underway. We are seeing videos out of southern Iran of what appear to be American helicopters flying low over the valleys in this mountainous region. But again, authorities in Iran are urging people in that area to try to find and capture this American aircrew, and they are offering a reward for anyone who's able to do so.
All right, Raph, we'll ask you to continue to stand by there. We do want to go back to Gabe Gutierrez at the White House with some more reporting about the president and him being briefed on this. Gabe, what do you know?
Yeah, that's right. According to White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt just a few moments ago, according to her, the president has been briefed on this incident. Again, we're awaiting any official comment from either him or Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth or CENTCOM that might shed some more light on what just unfolded here. But again, Joe, as I was reporting earlier, this does raise questions about the president's plan in the upcoming days and weeks for this war. He has been threatening an escalation, even yesterday saying that the U.S. has not even begun to attack what's left of Iran. Certainly the Defense Department had been saying that the U.S. has struck some 12,000 targets since the war began. A U.S. official telling NBC News that the military checklist for the war was nearing completion, but certainly the president suggesting that an escalation could happen over the coming days and weeks, about 2 to 3 more weeks. But again, the breaking news right now, the president of the United States has been briefed on this incident, and we're awaiting any official comment from him, Jeff.
All right, let's bring in NBC's Stephanie Gosk, who joins us now from on the ground in Tel Aviv. Steph, over the last few weeks, anytime we get an update from the Department of Defense, they talk about how much Iran's abilities to fire, to use drones, have been degraded substantially over time. So what do we know about Iran's capability of still firing, first at targets above in the sky and also at other targets throughout the Middle East?
Yeah, Joe. So the U.S. officials say that basically Iranian's military is decimated. Iranian officials say that's not the case. The only thing we know for sure, Joe, is what they're able to do with their military. And we've seen in the last 24 hours examples of what they're still capable of. Now, we don't know if this F-15 was actually shot down or not. But if it was, then that suggests they've got air defense systems that are still working. From our perspective here in Israel in the last 24 hours, we've certainly seen rocket attacks coming. I just came from a site that was impacted last night, and we saw some images of it. At least a large part of a rocket, or the entire rocket itself, hit a warehouse just outside of Tel Aviv, fairly close to the airport. We went out there. It's a warehouse that's owned by a company called Aerosol, which is an aerospace manufacturer, according to its website, and they make drones. Now, that certainly would seem to be a target that the Iranians would want to hit directly. We also have targets being hit in the Gulf today. You had a Kuwaiti oil refinery, as well as a desalination plant that was also targeted. So clearly there is still some ballistics ability that they have, and they are still hitting targets, Joe.
And Steph, that's sort of a sign of how things have sort of shifted in recent days, is this focus on the infrastructure that is in Iran when we talk about power plants, refineries, desalination plants, the bridge that the president was talking about on social media today, but also some of the energy infrastructure in other countries around Iran, correct?
Yeah, there is this kind of exchange back and forth between hitting infrastructure. The president putting up that video on Truth Social yesterday of the bridge in flames, smoke rising, saying that more will be hit. He's also said that power plants will be hit if there is no agreement that is reached. And then, yeah, you have a desalination plant in the Gulf is one of the most critical pieces of infrastructure for that part of the world, because that's how people get their fresh water. A desalination plant takes the salty water from the sea, takes the salt out, and then it becomes water that people can drink, Joe.
All right, Raph, let's bring you back in here. I know there have been these visuals emerging from Iran. We've had experts looking at those visuals to get a better idea of what happened with this fighter jet in Iran. What is it we're learning from those experts?
Yeah, Joe, so we ran some of these pictures past an expert. You may just be able to see on that bit of wreckage there there is the corner of a design, and one of the experts we ran that picture past says that design indicates that this F-15 was based at an American air base in the United Kingdom. It's called RAF Lakenheath, and we do know that warplanes from that base were moved from the UK to the Middle East to take part in this operation against Iran. So again, we do not have any official confirmation from the Pentagon, from the US military, but this expert who's knowledgeable is saying that that marking would be consistent with those of squadrons based at RAF Lakenheath. We've been saying, Joe, that this is a two-seater F-15. So normally what you have in that configuration is one pilot and one weapons operator. These are versatile aircraft. They can be used to strike against the ground. And as we've been seeing over and over again in this conflict, refueling aircraft are playing a big role, keeping these smaller fighter jets in the skies over Iran. You can imagine, Joe, just from the emphasis that Iranian authorities are putting on finding this air crew, that they would consider it an enormous coup if they were able to capture alive the two air crew from this F-15. From the Iranian perspective, those pilots would be a significant source of leverage in any future negotiations with the United States. You'll remember that the Islamic Republic back in 1979 began with a hostage crisis, holding American diplomats from the U.S. Embassy in Tehran hostage, using them in negotiations with the Carter administration before they were eventually released on the very first day of Ronald Reagan's presidency. And so as the Iranian regime eyes potential negotiations with the Trump administration on how to end this war, it would be a major bargaining chip for them if they did have two American pilots in their custody. And that explains, Joe, why they are offering this reward, the equivalent of some $60,000 to people in this tribal area if they are able to find these pilots. And again, they say capturing them alive is the priority. Joe.
Raf, I want to recap this breaking news this morning. Two U.S. officials telling us a two-seater F-15 went down over Iran Friday and that a U.S. military search and rescue effort is underway. That's what we know, Raf. I'm going to ask you a question that might be better for our Pentagon reporters, but perhaps you know the answer. Clearly, U.S. Central Command has to be prepared for every single possible scenario, including this possibility right here. Do we have an idea of how CENTCOM has prepared for a search and rescue operation like this within the borders of Iran? I have to imagine that would involve perhaps using helicopters, which can be more of a target if Iran is firing at U.S. military aircraft.
Yeah, absolutely, Joe. We don't know the details of the contingency planning CENTCOM would have done for this specific scenario over Iran, but you can guarantee any time that the U.S. military is sending fighter aircraft over hostile territory, there will have been planning for what happens if that aircraft goes down, whether it's shot down or whether it suffers some kind of technical malfunction. And at this point, we just don't know for sure in this case. But the basic playbook is this. First of all, the military will want to establish total air superiority over the region where that downed plane is thought to be. So you will have a lot of fighter aircraft in the sky, making sure that no Iranian jets or helicopters can interfere. You're then going to want a lot of aircraft for ground support. So these are planes, fighter jets, helicopters, to make sure that Iranian ground forces moving towards that area are not able to reach that crash site. Again, this is a fairly mountainous region of southern Iran. This would not necessarily be an easy operation for Iranian ground troops to make their way to the crash site, let alone for them to do it while under fire from the air. You're seeing on your screen right now what appears to be a refueling aircraft refueling two American helicopters over southern Iran. The final layer of any search and rescue operation, once you've established superiority in the air, once you've put assets in the air to make sure that Iranian ground troops can't reach the area, is to have boots on the ground, usually dropped from helicopters, to go and to recover those pilots. That obviously is the dangerous part, the incredibly dangerous part, where some American helicopter would need to land on the ground. Most likely special forces would have to climb out of that helicopter, and they would aim to recover that air crew, get them back in the helicopter, get back airborne, and then make their way safely out of Iran again. At this point, Joe, we just do not know, either from the U.S. side or from reports coming out of Iran, the fate of that air crew. It does seem clear that a large-scale search and rescue operation is underway. We do not know whether the U.S. has a detailed sense of where exactly that air crew might be, but it is very clear right now that both the United States military and the Iranians are looking for them. Jeff.
A video we showed a moment ago, a C-130 tanker, 2 helicopters flying over southern Iran. Let's go back to Gabe Gutierrez, who's at the White House, where the president is being briefed on the situation right now. Gabe, so many people are asking the question of what could be the off-ramp here. That depends on the negotiations with Iran. Where do those stand right now?
Well, at this point, there are a lot of questions about where those stands. Of course, there have been messages traded between the U.S. and Iran through Pakistani intermediaries. Earlier this week, the president told the New York Post that the U.S. had been in direct talks, actually, with the parliamentary speaker inside Iran, although there have been a lot of questions about the frequency of those messages and what Iran has actually agreed to. There are many unanswered questions about any potential off-ramp here. Just earlier this week, the president said that it didn't matter if the Iranians came to the negotiating table or not, because the U.S. had already decimated so much of Iran's capabilities. Now, certainly, this breaking news raises questions about the potential for escalation in the next coming days. We should point out, Joe, the U.S. officials have not confirmed exactly how that fighter jet came down, so we're still waiting for any more information on that, and awaiting any further comment from the president or the defense secretary. But again, for those just tuning in, the press secretary here at the White House saying that the president has been briefed at this point. The president suggesting earlier today that the U.S. could somehow get more involved in taking back or reopening the Strait of Hormuz, Joe.
All right, Gabe Gutierrez and our entire team, thank you so much for your reporting. That concludes this NBC News special report. We'll have more ahead on our streaming network, NBC News Now, online at NBCNews.com. A full wrap-up tonight on NBC Nightly News. I'm Joe Fryer. Thank you for watching. We're continuing our breaking news coverage right here on NBC News Now. I'm Joe Fryer. Right now in the Middle East, the U.S. military is staging an urgent search and rescue mission after an American fighter jet went down over Iran earlier today. That is according to 2 U.S. officials. It is not clear how or why that jet went down. The White House says President Trump has now been briefed. NBC's Stephanie Goss joins us now from the ground in Tel Aviv. Stephanie, the reporting coming in slowly here. We know the president has been briefed. We're waiting to get more reaction from the president and the Department of Defense. But set the scene for us on how things have been playing out over the last few hours in the Middle East.
Yeah, sure. So it was actually the Iranians that said that, and this was the Revolutionary Guard that said that they had shot down an F-15 in the southern part of the country. This is a mountainous area, not very easy to get to. And then we have this confirmation from 2 U.S. officials that it was an F-15 and that there is a search and rescue operation going on. Joe, I think it's very difficult to overstate how the complexity of this operation with Iran would change if the Iranian government was able to locate these 2 pilots and actually take them in their custody and then essentially hold them as hostage. So that search and rescue team that's in the country right now, according to the Pentagon, has a very urgent task at hand to try to locate and rescue these fighter pilots. It also really raises the question, and although these officials did not say how this F-15 went down, it raises the question over what remains of the Iranian military. What is the capability that they still have? If they were able to shoot down an F-15, that means that there are air defenses that are still operating. It is not easy to shoot down an F-15. And I would also say that the ballistic missiles continue to fly here towards Israel, including a warehouse that was hit last night, run by a company called Aerosol, which is a company that manufactures drones. They're also capable of hitting a number of Kuwaiti installations, an oil refinery, together with a desalination plant. So there is still clearly some capability there, even though U.S. officials say that the military is decimated. Iranian officials say they're just fine. The reality is probably somewhere in the middle. Joe.
Steph, we'll ask you to continue to stand by there in Israel. For more, let's bring in retired U.S. Army Colonel Steve Warren. He's also an NBC News military analyst. Colonel, good to have you with us. Your reaction, just some of the news that we're hearing here about the two-seater F-15 going down over Iran. We don't yet know how exactly that happened. Walk us through the training that those pilots have likely gone through and how U.S. Central Command prepares for a scenario like this with a jet fighter going down within the borders of Iran.
Sure, Joe, and this is tragic. And of course, we're thinking now, most importantly, about those two pilots, and we hope that they're well and are rapidly recovered. So two questions there. Number one, how do they prepare for this ahead of a mission? And it's part of every mission package. So before any aircraft launches into enemy territory, the military plans for how they will be recovered if something goes wrong. So if it's a mechanical failure or if they're shot down by enemy fire, there is a plan in place, including rescue helicopters, additional overhead cover to keep the enemy away from the crash site, and personnel trained specifically to retrieve downed pilots. So all of those resources were in place before this F-15 even launched into Iran. So that's the good news. Additional important things to keep in mind, you'd asked about the type of training these downed pilots go through. And it's rigorous training. It's called SEER school, Survival, Escape, Evasion school, and it's run by the United States Army, and it's training that goes up to 21 days, some of the most rigorous training in the Army. These young men and women are subjected to very rigorous, simulated capture processes. So they learn how to hide, how to run, how to survive, how to use whatever resources they come across in order to help their survival. And in the worst case scenario, if they're captured, they learn how to conduct themselves under that type of situation.
Colonel, a moment ago we heard Stephanie Goss say it can be hard to shoot down a fighter jet. I have to imagine it's a little bit easier to shoot down a helicopter that's going to be used in a search and rescue operation like this. How dangerous are these operations?
It's very dangerous. And this is, of course, to be clear, inside of enemy territory. Inside of enemy territory that may have already successfully taken down an F-15. Again, to be clear, we don't know why that F-15 came out of the sky. It may have been a mechanical, it may have been enemy fire. But if it was enemy fire, that tells us, as Stephanie explained, that the Iranians still do have some anti-air capability. And you're absolutely right, Joe. A helicopter, quite frankly, is easier to shoot down than an F-15 aircraft. So, there is danger on top of danger. But this speaks largely sort of to the American way of war. We don't leave our people behind. We don't leave pilots down. Men and women in the Army and in all the armed forces, they will put their own lives in danger to rescue these downed pilots.
And Colonel, for the past few weeks, you've been with us as we've watched these Defense Department briefings from the Defense Secretary, from the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, talking about how the Iran military is decimated, talking about these dramatic percentages of how much they've been able to reduce Iran's ability to fire and to use drones. So the fact that, and again, we don't know what happened here, we don't know how this fighter jet went down, but we also have seen Iran firing at Kuwait and hitting targets there. What do we know right now about how much firepower Iran has and its ability to defend itself at this stage of the war?
Yeah, so clearly they retain some capability. As you said, they are continuing to fire on Gulf nations. They are continuing to fire on U.S. assets that are in Gulf nations, and even Israel is continuing to receive fires, although much of that now coming from Lebanon. But so we know that the Iranians still have some capability. We know, for example, that maritime ship captains remain largely unwilling to transit the Strait of Hormuz. Why? Because they perceive a threat. So we know that the Iranians still maintain some capability. We absolutely understand after, somewhere between 10 and 15,000 targets having been struck already. Of course, we know that their capabilities are largely degraded, but clearly their capabilities have not been completely eliminated. Joe.
What can something like this do for a war where we know the president has talked about perhaps 2 or 3 weeks trying to bring it to an end, although a lot of questions center on how exactly that's going to happen? When something like this happens, does it impact the U.S. military game plan, or does it depend on, I guess at the end of the day, what exactly happened, how it unfolded, and how everyone responded to it?
Yeah, so there's tactical events and there's strategic events, Joe. And this is a tactical event that may or may not have a strategic implication. Right. So let's keep in mind some larger context. During the Iraq War, I think it was 7 American personnel were taken as POWs at some point along the way, right? So the American military understands prisoners of war. This is something we prepare for and train for, and we were able to adapt to, and we were able to fight through this. So the idea that it will change the military's mode of operation, the way that Central Command is executing this fight, I don't think it will. So that's sort of at the tactical level. Admiral Cooper is going to continue to execute the missions that he's been given, and he's going to execute them at the highest level that he's capable of doing with the resources and assets that he has. So that's the tactical level. At the strategic level, it remains to be seen. How will the president react? How will the nation react? How will the president change what he's doing? How will he change his orders, or will he change his orders based on the fact that, if there are some prisoners of war? So that part we don't know. But I can tell you with maximum confidence that the United States military will continue to execute the orders that it's been given.
Colonel Warren will ask you to continue to stand by here. Let's go back to NBC's Raf Sanchez, who is in Doha. Raf, walk us through what it is that we are learning this morning and whether we've seen any incidents similar to this in the past. What could we learn from that?
Well, Joe, as far as we know right now, the race is on in southern Iran between the U.S. military and the Iranian regime to try to find this 2-person air crew of that F-15 that went down. We know from U.S. officials that a search and rescue operation is underway. We are seeing videos coming from southern Iran of what appear to be American helicopters flying through the mountains and valleys of that region trying to locate this air crew. And we know at the same time from Iranian regime authorities in the south of the country that they are putting out basically a bounty on these 2 pilots. They are offering a reward, the equivalent of $60,000 to anyone, especially in the tribal areas of that region, who is able to find these pilots. They say capturing them alive is the priority. And as we've been talking about, to capture these 2 pilots alive would be an enormous bargaining chip for the Iranian regime as it looks ahead to the prospect of negotiations with the Trump administration. The colonel was just mentioning that there have been incidents in the past where American pilots have been downed over enemy territory. John McCain, obviously one of the most famous, shot down over Vietnam, held prisoner by the North Vietnamese. More recently, Joe, in the 1990s, in 1995, an F-16 was shot down over Bosnia. That pilot evaded capture for 6 days in the woods of Bosnia, being pursued by Serbian forces before he was eventually rescued by the United States military. Now, that is a better outcome. You might remember also in the incident that Americans remember as Black Hawk Down, when an American helicopter went down over Mogadishu in Somalia. In that case, a pilot was captured by a militia group. He was held prisoner for 11 days. That was something of a national trauma back in the mid-90s under the presidency of Bill Clinton. So we are waiting to see right now who it is. First of all, we just do not know the fate of this air crew, but we do know that both the U.S. military and the Iranians are trying as hard as they can right now to find them and to get to them. Jeff.
Right. Raf Sanchez, thank you so much. We are going to take a quick break. We'll have much more of our breaking news coverage as the U.S. military searches for that fighter jet that went down over Iran. We will bring you the latest next.
Has the potential to signal another escalation in this war. It was just several days ago, just earlier this week on Wednesday, that the president went before the American people and touted the success of the U.S. military operation inside Iran. He suggested that the U.S. would continue airstrikes for the next 2 to 3 weeks, and he did say that Iran would be hit harder during that time, also suggesting that the escalation would come if Iran did not reopen the vital Strait of Hormuz. Still, though, there are many questions about negotiations to end this war, whether there would be some sort of off-ramp here. But this would be significant, Joe. Again, we don't know how exactly this plane came down, but if it were to have been shot down by enemy fire, so far, U.S. officials had not confirmed that any any U.S. fighter jet has been shot down by the Iranians, although the Iranian government has claimed to have done so. There was that incident earlier in this war, shortly after it started, where Kuwait accidentally shot down 3 U.S. fighter jets in what CENTCOM described as an incident of friendly fire. But at this point, again, that breaking news that we're learning from 2 U.S. officials that an F-15 fighter jet, a 2-seater, has come down over Iran. An urgent search and rescue mission, as you mentioned, is now underway. We are awaiting any official comment yet from the president or from the Secretary of Defense, Joe.
And Gabe, depending on the outcome of the search and rescue, depending on what we learn about why the jet even went down in the first place, this could add to some of the mounting political pressure the president is facing from the public, from some politicians, to try and bring an end to this war, which polls show is not terribly popular, with gas prices going up dramatically over the last several weeks. Where do things stand when it comes to the White House with trying to figure out an exit strategy for this conflict?
Well, certainly, just over the last several days, we've gotten a new round of polling, including a CNN poll earlier this week that said that just 34% of Americans approved of the U.S. military action in Iran. That is down from just a few weeks ago. And certainly something the White House is watching very closely, as you mentioned, are those rising gas prices. Now, certainly, the White House is seizing on a jobs number that came out earlier today that was higher than forecast. But that analysis comes from before this war started. So ahead of the midterms over the next several months, certainly the White House, the Trump administration, wondering how this will play out politically. Now, with gas shooting up significantly since the war began, now averaging well over $4 a gallon, and the cost of fuel potentially raising everything from airfare to a variety of different consumer goods that could be affected in the coming months. So again, at this point, we have not heard any immediate reaction from the president to this news. It is still a very fluid situation, but this comes at a time where a growing number of Americans are growing skeptical of this war. And it was just a short time ago, Joe, just a few weeks ago, I believe, that the administration was planning to ask Congress for a significant amount of money, $200 billion, to fund this war in Iran, although we understand that that request has not been officially submitted to Congress just yet. It's unclear. Just over the last several days, the president saying this conflict would last another 2 to 3 weeks. However, this morning, he on a social media post suggesting that if the U.S. had more time, that it could take the Strait of Hormuz, perhaps get more involved in the Strait of Hormuz. And look, this raises a whole host of questions that the president being very frustrated, increasing level of frustration with European allies that he says have not done enough to protect the Strait of Hormuz and keep it reopened. And we do know that while 20 to 25% of the world's oil flows through that crucial waterway, the president and the administration says that the U.S. gets no oil from that. That is not correct. There is some oil that the U.S. From that waterway that the U.S. uses, but the fact is it affects that global energy supply, global oil supply that does have an effect on prices here in the U.S. So a lot of implications here on the length of this conflict. And again, with that breaking news that a U.S. fighter jet has come down over Iran, the details of how it exactly had happened, we're waiting to find out. But it does also raise questions about U.S. and Israeli claims of U.S. dominance over the skies over Iran, and as you've been discussing with your previous guest, the colonel, the capabilities of the Iranians to shoot down potentially any U.S. aircraft, Joe.
Gabe, we know you're going to let us know as soon as we hear any word from the president or the White House. Let's bring in our senior national security correspondent, Courtney Cubey. She has been working her sources. Courtney, what are you learning?
Yeah, so we do now know, according to a U.S. official, that it does appear that this F-15 was shot down, presumably by the Iranians, just given where it was. Now, this is, of course, an interesting development, given the fact that the Trump administration has repeatedly said that they have virtually decimated the Iranian air defense systems. Now, Joe, there is some truth to that, right? We have seen the U.S. military take out a tremendous number of Iranian strategic air defenses, so they're more advanced systems, and then some of their mobile launchers as well. These are things that have the ability to launch off ballistic missiles, to launch off interceptors that could take down a U.S. aircraft like an F-15. But what's clear here today is that, in fact, the U.S. has absolutely not taken down or taken out all of Iran's air defense systems. And you also may remember that back, almost a year and a half ago now, the Israeli military went into Iran and conducted a series of strikes where they also struck many of Iran's strategic air defense systems. In that case, they were largely targeting their radar systems. The reason that that's so critical is many of these, what are known as their strategic air defense systems, you may hear of them talked about as an S-300 or something, they're often linked to one another. So they have these radars that basically talk to each other that are staged throughout critical areas like around Tehran, around some of their nuclear facilities. The radars talk to one another. They can find something that may be flying overhead that may present a threat, and then that allows these interceptors, these batteries of interceptors, to fire off to potentially take down an aircraft like this. We also know that this is not the first time that Iran has been able to down U.S. aircraft during the course of this last 5 weeks or so of this war. But what we are aware of so far is that they have taken down U.S. drones, things like Reapers. It's not always clear, however, Joe, whether those are actually shot down or could be brought down by other means. Things like electronic jamming or electronic warfare can potentially impact unmanned systems like that. But again, what we are learning now, according to a U.S. official, is that it does appear likely that this F-15 was shot down over Iran. We have been working on this story all morning to try to figure out what the U.S. knows about those two pilots who were piloting that aircraft at the time that it went down. Now, remember, the U.S. has a tremendous amount of logistical support already forward in the region. What would be very standard in a case like what we're seeing in Iran, when the U.S. is conducting these massive hundreds and hundreds of strikes every single day, is the U.S. would move forward what's known as a personnel recovery team, or in this case, probably multiple teams, given the operational tempo of this war. They would be forward in the region so that when something like this happens, they are there, they are ready, and they go in quickly to try to recover those pilots. But again, at this point, we don't really have a sense of exactly what happened to these pilots beyond the fact that there is an ongoing and extensive search and rescue effort underway by the U.S. military. Joe.
So, Courtney, with this reporting that this fighter jet was likely shot down, how could that change things when it comes to the U.S. military strategy right now in Iran?
It's a great question, but I don't know that it will have a real impact on it. The U.S. has been trying to to identify and strike as many of Iran's air defense systems, so things like those S-300s I was talking about. They're mobile systems that they can they're literally on wheels, and they can move them around the country so they can fire off something and then move it quickly so that it doesn't become a quick target. But the U.S. has also been working to try to go after Iran's ballistic missile systems, their production facilities, their stockpiles, the launchers for the ballistic missiles, go after their drones, their anti-ship ballistic missile capabilities. All of these things, the more conventional systems that Iran has that really present a threat over the skies and around the region from Iran, the U.S. has been striking that systematically. But the reality, what today proves, is what we have been talking about for days now, and that is that the threat remains. And even though the U.S. is supposed to have complete control of the U.S. military, complete control over the skies of Iran, what this proves here today, Joe, is that complete control doesn't mean that there is no threat to the aircraft that are flying overhead. It is why this war continues to be so dangerous for the men and women who are prosecuting it from the U.S. side.
All right, Courtney, we'll ask you to stand by and let us know if you have any new reporting there. Let's go to NBC's Stephanie Goss to talk more about that last point Courtney was making. Steph is in Tel Aviv, and just what we are seeing throughout the entire region, how dangerous this remains for so many countries, including where Steph is in Israel and also Iran right now. Walk us through what we've been seeing in the last 24 hours there.
Sure. And I'll share a story with you. Just a couple of days ago, we went out to this small neighborhood outside of Tel Aviv that had gotten hit by some of these cluster munitions. And while we were there, the Minister of Defense, Israel Katz, showed up, and he was talking to people there and reassuring them that the Israeli military was continuing to strike Iran along with the U.S. One of the things that we found very interesting is he said one of the challenges they're facing is that there is a lot that is underground. And he compared the tunnels being used in Iran by the military there to tunnels being used by Hamas in Gaza. There's no way to know for sure, but certainly he suggested that that's one of the things that has made it difficult to get to all of the military resources in Iran. And then we have what we've just been seeing here in Israel, throughout the Gulf, that these ballistic missile strikes keep happening with frequency, and they are accurate at times. In the last 24 hours here, just outside of Tel Aviv, fairly close to the airport, there was a missile strike at a warehouse. And we have video of the moment, and you can tell that you can't tell if it's the full rocket, but certainly a large portion of it, because it hits a site and it blows up. It turns out, we were just out there today, it's a warehouse, and it is run by a company called Aerosol. And on their website, they say that they're an aerospace manufacturer. Among the things that they make are drones. So that certainly suggests a target that Iran might be interested in. On top of that, you have the targets in the Gulf. Oil infrastructure continues to be hit. Kuwaiti oil refinery was hit today, along with a desalination plant. And that is real critical civilian infrastructure. Desalination plants in the Gulf are how people get drinking water, Joe.
All right, Steph, thank you so much for your reporting there in Tel Aviv. For more, let's bring in retired U.S. Army Colonel Steve Warren, also an NBC News military analyst. Colonel, first, I just want to get your reaction to Courtney's reporting, a U.S. official saying it's likely that this fighter jet was shot down. Also, just help us understand just how urgent this search and rescue mission is right now and the resources that the U.S. military would be putting into that.
Sure, I'll use a military term. You know, we often say it's, all hands on deck. And my guess is that's exactly what's happening there in the U.S. Central Command area of responsibility. Everyone is focused now on how to rapidly and safely recover these two down pilots. So there is, I don't think there will be a single resource withheld in the effort to recover these men and women who are on this very dangerous mission. Courtney's points were so good about, describing the way we have systematically eliminated the Iranian, what in the military we call the Integrated Air Defense System, IADS, the Integrated Air Defense System. And this is the network of high capability missiles and radars that defend an area, in this case, Iran. Now, one thing that we sometimes can forget about, in addition to these much more high technology capabilities, there are also somewhat lower technology capabilities. For example, a Stinger missile or the Iranian version of that. So there are some man-portable, smaller capabilities that are much more difficult for us to find because there are so many of them. And frankly, Joe, we don't know the details. Was this aircraft flying high and it would need a long-range missile to hit it? Or was it on a low-level strafing run and could potentially have even been engaged with just ground fire bullets? So still a lot to learn here.
All right, Colonel Warren, we appreciate your analysis throughout this. Again, Courtney Kuby's reporting, a U.S. official saying this U.S. fighter jet appears to have been shot down by Iran. The fate of those inside the jet not immediately clear. An urgent search and rescue mission is underway right now. We will have much more coverage ahead here on NBC News Now, online on NBCNews.com. I'm Joe Fryer. NBC News Daily picks up the coverage after a break.
Good Friday, everyone. I'm Vicki Wynn. My co-anchor Morgan is off. NBC News Daily starts right now. Today is Friday, April 3rd. Fighter jet down. U.S. officials confirming a search and rescue mission is underway after a two-seater military aircraft appears to have been shot down by Iran. We will have the latest from the Pentagon, the White House, and we're live in Tel Aviv. Strong showing, the U.S. economy exceeding expectations last month, adding 178,000 jobs. Why some experts are concerned, though, that the job market is still vulnerable. New details. We are learning more about the circumstances surrounding the abrupt firing of Attorney General Pam Bondi, plus how some Epstein survivors are responding to her ousting. Final Four, the last weekend of March Madness, kicks off in just a few hours. We're going to preview the high-stakes matchups ahead of all the action. We begin this Friday with breaking news out of Iran, where a search and rescue effort is underway after an American fighter jet appears to have been shot down by Iran. U.S. officials are telling NBC News that the two-seater F-15 was shot down over Iranian territory. Local Iranian news outlets are reporting that at least one pilot is believed to be alive. White House Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt now confirming that President Trump has been briefed on this situation. NBC News senior national security correspondent Courtney QB joins me now. Courtney, what do we know at this hour about how this jet went down and the mission that is underway right now?
Yeah, so at this point, I mean, the information is still coming in, but it does appear that this was a U.S. F-15, a two-seater. It went down in Iran. It looks at this point, according to U.S. official, likely that Iran was able to shoot it down. Now, we are just getting in that it appears that one of the pilots has been rescued by the U.S. military search and rescue teams, and it appears that that individual is alive. That's all we know. We don't know anything more about the condition, but this is just coming into us now. So, I mean, keep in mind how unbelievably dangerous the skies are over Iran right now, despite the fact that we have had the Trump administration, and particularly Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, saying that they own the skies over Iran. That does not mean that there's not a continuing threat, both from Iran's air defense systems, which have not been completely destroyed by the U.S. military strikes, but also by fire from the ground that is not just necessarily air defenses. And it's evidence here today. You can see the photos that we're showing there on screen appear to be the wreckage of an F-15. Also keep in mind, this is now the fourth F-15 that we know of that has been lost in this war so far. There were three that were shot down as what was essentially friendly fire by the Kuwaiti military as three U.S. F-15s were landing early last month in Kuwait.
Courtney, as you mentioned, a very volatile, very dynamic and dangerous situation in the skies above Iran. One pilot rescued alive. That's the breaking news you just brought us. Do we know if there was anyone else on board that jet? And can you talk to us about the advanced teams you've been reporting on and how they were able to carry out this rescue successfully?
Yeah, so this is a two-seater, so there would have been two individuals on board. And so the search and rescue presumably are still looking for that second person. Now, keep in mind, when the U.S. military is conducting an operation like this, or a war, I mean, the U.S. is at war in Iran and has been now for about 5 weeks, they will very typically move forward what are known as personnel recovery teams. They're often special operations forces. They move them very close into the region, and they are on a constant standby for exactly this sort of potential, so that they can move in if there's any kind of evidence that there potentially a U.S. aircraft may be down, that there may be U.S. personnel essentially behind enemy lines that need to be recovered or rescued. They will move in quickly to go and find them. So at this point, I wouldn't be surprised if that's what's involved in this effort, in addition to other search and rescue teams, and just knowing how much the U.S. has pushed forward into the region in the last several weeks and months, I suspect that there is a huge search and rescue team that's underway, continuing to look for that second pilot.
I sure hope you're right, and we're glad that that first pilot was rescued. Courtney QB, thank you so much for that breaking news. Let's bring in NBC News senior White House correspondent Gabe Gutierrez, standing by on the White House North Lawn. So, Gabe, we mentioned earlier President Trump has been briefed, but we are still awaiting a direct update from the president. What do we know about how the White House is responding so far to this situation in Iran?
Well, certainly, Vicki. We have no official response from the White House except for what you just mentioned. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt confirming that President Trump has been briefed. We're awaiting any comment from him or perhaps from CENTCOM that is yet to come. But Vicki, this comes just days. This development comes just 2 days after the president went before the American people in a rare primetime address here from the White House, touting the American military success inside Iran and saying that the military goals in this conflict were nearing completion, although he did suggest that the U.S. might escalate this war over the next 2 to 3 weeks before discontinuing airstrikes. Now, over the last several days, he has suggested that the U.S. has been speaking with members of the Iranian regime, although details of those communications have been hard to come by. But the president, the Secretary of Defense as well, and administration officials have been repeatedly touting just how decimated Iran's capabilities have been, how decimated and degraded their air defense capabilities have been as well. And so this raises some questions about that. We've heard from the Pentagon that Iran has been firing over 90% less missiles now than they were at the start of this conflict. But as Courtney has been reporting, these developments with this F-15 fighter jet being shot down signifies just how dangerous the skies over Iran remain. Many questions now about whether this escalates, how the president responds to this. But again, we're awaiting any news from that urgent search and rescue mission that continues to be underway, Vicki.
We'll be sure to go back to you for updates. Gabe Gutierrez, thank you. Let's go ahead and bring in NBC News senior national correspondent Stephanie Gosk, who is standing by live in Tel Aviv, Israel now. Stephanie, local Iranian officials earlier promised a, quote, valuable reward for any information that leads to the capture of this potential U.S. military pilot. We know one pilot has been rescued already. What is Iran doing? What are their efforts now to try to get one of those pilots on board that plane?
Right. Well, it changes the dynamic for the Iranian government significantly, doesn't it? If they suddenly have a U.S. fighter pilot in their custody holding that person hostage, it's going to change how they negotiate with the United States. It is a bargaining chip, a significant one. But there's also a question, too, of how this might change the dynamic politically for the White House. Does it change the conversation in the United States among the public? Already, this is not a popular war. You have gas prices over $4 a gallon. It is certainly within the realm of possibility that it could become even less popular, especially if there is a fighter pilot that's held hostage or if this drags on. And that becomes a question of how much really remains of the Iranian military. Is it decimated, as they say, or are they still able to do some things? Because we are still seeing, in addition to an F-15 being shot down, we are seeing ballistic missiles fired towards Israel, towards the Gulf, still happening on a daily basis and with some accuracy.
Yeah, Stephanie, pick it up there. You're in Tel Aviv, and earlier the Israeli Defense Forces confirmed they have identified missiles launched from Iran into Israel where you are. What more do we know about that?
Yeah, they happen on a daily basis, and we hear bomb sirens on a daily basis here in the Tel Aviv area, but certainly up in the northern country, to the south. It is happening consistently. And, you know, I'll point you to just one incident in the last 24 hours, a warehouse that was hit. There's video of it. It appears to be either a large portion of a rocket or the entire rocket itself that slipped past the defenses, the substantial defenses in this country, hit this warehouse, which we now know is run by a company that manufactures drones. So that certainly seems like it would have been a target that the Iranian government would be interested in. It shows that they are at least still capable of pulling off an attack like that, Vicki.
Stephanie, we touched on it briefly as we talked with Gabe Gutierrez earlier. He's standing by at the White House for an official response. We understand the president has been briefed on what happened here, but you're there. Let's talk about what this means. Israel's involvement, the U.S.'s involvement. There was a lot of talk about this war having an end in sight, negotiations underway. As you mentioned, this changes the dynamic. What is a possible worst-case scenario here?
Well, when you look at the timeline, and it's really the White House that has been talking timelines. The Israeli government has said very little in terms of timelines. It started off as 3 to 5 weeks, then it moved to 4 to 6 weeks, and then in the president's address to the nation, he said, well, there'll be 2 to 3 weeks more. It's going to be over, quote, shortly, very shortly, but with not a whole lot of detail. And you know, the timeline, depending on some objectives that include, obviously, the decimation of the military. There also include, and I've said before, the dismantling of the Iranian proxies like Hezbollah and the Houthis in this region so that they no longer can attack Israel or the United States. And there's also the huge looming question of their nuclear capability. In that speech, the president said that the enriched uranium is still in the country, but that it is deeply buried in a couple of places, Natanz, Isfahan, and it would be incredibly difficult and it would take a long time to go in and look for it. And the president suggested in that speech that the U.S. does not have any appetite to do that, at least in these public comments of his. He did say that they are watching those sites to see if it's extracted. Beyond that, Vicky, you're looking at the Strait of Hormuz. And when we talk about Iran's capability, they are still capable of keeping that strait all but shut down. Doesn't take much. A drone hit on an oil tanker and, you know, those tankers stop moving altogether. And that's certainly what we have seen. They still have a stranglehold over that incredibly important pressure point in this effort. Vicky.
Yes, then it has so much to do with the cost of consumer goods as well. And Stephanie, you also mentioned desalination tanks, facilities being a major target potentially as well, those plants, how people get fresh water in that region. So we're going to continue to follow the developments in this breaking story. Stephanie Gosk live in Tel Aviv, Israel for us right now. Thank you, Stephanie. Keep it right here. You're watching NBC News Daily.
This is an NBC News special report.
Good day, everybody. We are coming on the air with some breaking news out of the Middle East. NBC News has learned that one American pilot was rescued by the U.S. military after an F-15 U.S. fighter jet was shot down over Iran. And that pilot who was rescued is still, in fact, alive. That is according to a U.S. official. Another American pilot is still, though, unaccounted for. I want to bring in our senior national security correspondent, Courtney Cube, who's standing by for us. Courtney, this is a fast-moving story here. What are we learning?
Yeah, so at this point, it's literally developing minute by minute. According to a U.S. official, it does appear that this F-15E, it's often known as a Strike Eagle, that it was shot down by Iran. It's deep inside of Iranian territory. The two pilots are believed to have ejected from that aircraft. And as you mentioned, we now know, according to a U.S. official, that at least one of those individuals has been recovered alive. We don't know anything else about that person's condition. Search and rescue efforts remain underway right now. Now, what's standard in a case like this, the U.S. has gone to war in Iran. In advance of a big military action like this, the U.S. would generally put forward in the region something known as a personnel recovery team. In this case, most likely, just given the operational tempo and the size of this war, they would have put multiple personnel recovery teams. And they are on a constant standby while the U.S. is flying any kind of combat missions like this, so that if there is something that happens where U.S. Service members go down essentially behind enemy lines, they can respond immediately to go in and try to find those individuals. Now, this is the first time that we know about that a manned aircraft has gone down inside Iran as part of this war. And it's significant, Yasmin, and that is because it dispels this idea that the U.S. has complete and total autonomy or control over the airspace over Iran right now. While they may have largely control over it, that doesn't mean that it is not a dangerous mission for U.S. men and women who are flying over there. There are hundreds of targets that they are still striking every single day. That is manned and unmanned. But we know that in recent days, the U.S. has really upped the number of bomber runs. So obviously manned bomber fighters, aircraft that have been flying over Iran. It still remains an extremely dangerous mission for them, Yaz.
Yeah, it's a good point. We have heard repeatedly from Secretary of Defense Hegseth, along with the president as well, that the U.S. has complete and total control over the airspace within Iran. And now seeing the downing of this F-15 fighter jet certainly speaks to a different perspective as to this ongoing war. Court, do we have any reporting as to whether or not this individual, this fighter pilot, is actually still inside Iran and safe, or has he left Iran?
We don't. That's one of the questions that we're trying to figure out, is if they've actually gotten the individual out of the airspace and presumably to some sort of medical attention, and we don't know that quite yet. I mean, the situation remains very sensitive because obviously if the U.S. is looking for this second pilot, Iran is probably looking as well. And so right now it is really a race against time to see who can find that person first and hopefully find them alive and get them to safety and some sort of medical attention, anything that they may need to try to take care of them. But at this point, we just don't know. We keep waiting for more information out of the U.S. military, but the hours are just grinding on without a lot of detail.
Courtney Cube, thank you. Want to go to NBC Stephanie Gosk, who's standing by for us on the ground in Tel Aviv. Steph, if you will, give us a sense of the reaction on the ground with the downing of this F-15 fighter jet, along with what is happening there in the ongoing conflict between the United States, Israel, and Iran.
Sure. You know, Yasmin, the big question remains, what capability does the Iranian military still have? Courtney was talking about the air defense systems being decimated, according to U.S. officials, where they say that a lot of the the ballistic missile capabilities are decimated as well. And you know, here in this region, in Israel and in the Gulf, there are certainly ballistic missiles still being launched from Iran. There are fewer of them, to be sure, but they are being launched, and they are being launched with some accuracy. We know here in Tel Aviv, just outside of the city, there was a warehouse that was hit that was being used by a company to manufacture drones. We know that today an oil refinery in Kuwait was hit, along with a desalination plant. And that's not the first desalination plant to be hit in the Gulf. Those plants so vital to get people water in that part of the world. Yasmin?
Yeah, certainly some major developments in this ongoing conflict. Stephanie Gosk, thank you. We're going to bring you the very latest as the story develops, but for now, that concludes this NBC special report. We're going to have much more ahead on our streaming network, NBC News Now. I'm Yasmin Vasugian. Thanks for watching.